Have you ever been the one person in your family who just doesn't fit? The one they look at with a mix of pity and scorn? I lived that life for 28 years. It all came to a head one Christmas, over something as small as a store-bought pumpkin pie, an insult that pushed me to build a new life in secret, brick by painful brick. The drive to my parents' house for our annual Christmas family dinner was always the same. The 10 miles of familiar road felt like a slow crawl toward a verdict I already knew. My hands, cold despite the car's heater blasting on high, gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. In the passenger seat sat the source of my immediate anxiety, a cardboard box from a nice bakery downtown. Inside was a perfect golden brown pumpkin pie. It looked delicious. It smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg. But in my family it was a symbol, a white flag of surrender. My car had needed a new transmission last month, a catastrophic expense that had wiped out my savings and left my credit cards screaming for mercy. There was simply no money, and no time between my administrative job and the freelance data entry I did at night to bake the multi-layered, ridiculously complex dessert my sister, Tiffany, always demanded I contribute. This pie was my compromise. It was the best I could do. I knew it wouldn't be good enough. It failed. Pulling into the driveway of the pristine two-story colonial I grew up in, I saw Tiffany's gleaming new SUV parked near the front. Of course, it was probably a Christmas gift from her husband, Chad. Another trophy for her to display. I took a deep breath, grabbed the box, and walked toward the front door, the sound of cheerful Christmas music and loud laughter already spilling out. The knot of dread in my stomach tightened. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and roasting turkey, but all I could smell was judgment. My mother, Carol, gave me a quick, distracted hug, her eyes immediately flicking to the box in my hands. "Oh, Savannah, you made it." Her smile was thin. "Practice." My father, Richard, boomed from the living room, not looking up from the football game on the television. Then I saw her. Tiffany. She was holding court by the fireplace, a glass of champagne in one hand, looking like a magazine ad in a sleek, crimson dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She turned, and her perfectly painted smile faltered for just a second as she saw the bakery box. "Oh, Savannah," she said, her voice a weapon wrapped in silk. She glided over to me, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "You didn't have to. We all know things are tight for you right now." She took the box from my hands before I could protest, and placed it on the granite countertop in the kitchen. Her movements were a performance for the small audience of aunts and uncles gathered nearby. With a dramatic flourish, she lifted the lid. A collective gaze fell upon the humble pumpkin pie. Tiffany let out a small, sharp laugh. It wasn't a real laugh. It was a sound designed to cut. "Store-bought? Seriously?" she asked, looking around at our relatives as if to say, "Can you believe this?" My face burned hot. I felt every eye in the room on me. My mother just offered another one of her weak, apologetic smiles. My father was still glued to the TV. Chad, Tiffany's husband, stood awkwardly behind her, looking down at his expensive shoes, refusing to meet my gaze. He was a professional at looking uncomfortable. My car needed repairs, Tiff," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't have time." "There's always an excuse," she sighed, closing the box with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "It's fine. I made a 7-layer chocolate torte. We won't even need this." She patted the box like it was a stray dog. "It's just a little embarrassing, you know?" She then turned to our mother. "Honestly, Mom, I don't know why we even pretend Savannah is useful in the kitchen." The word hung in the air. Useless. It was her favorite label for me. Savannah the useless, Savannah the failure, Savannah the nobody. The rest of the evening was a blur of similar, smaller cuts. At the dinner table, when the conversation turned to work, Tiffany loudly announced she had just been made a partner at her real estate firm. The table erupted in congratulations. My dad finally looked away from the game, his face lit with pride. He reached across the table and clapped Chad on the shoulder. "Now that's a son-in-law to be proud of," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. The implication was a slap in the face. His daughter, was not someone to be proud of. I was the quiet admin assistant with the broken-down car and the store-bought pie. I was an afterthought at my own family's Christmas dinner. Excluded, laughed at, mocked. To defend myself, to explain that my job was steady, that I was trying, but my voice was swallowed by the fresh round of laughter. As one of my uncles told a loud joke, no one was listening, no one cared. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes and knew I couldn't stay a moment longer. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "I have an early morning," I stammered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "I should go." My mom just said, "Drive safe, honey," her attention already turning back to Tiffany's story about a difficult client she had charmed. I walked out of that house, the sound of their party of physical force pushing me away. I got into my cold car, the bakery box still sitting on the kitchen counter, a monument to my humiliation. The tears I'd been holding back finally came, hot and furious. I wasn't just sad, I was incandescent with rage. A rage at them, but also at myself for letting it happen, year after year. Sitting there in the darkness, with the festive lights of their perfect home twinkling in my rearview mirror, I made a vow. It wasn't loud. It was a cold, hard promise I made to the deepest part of myself. This was the last time, the absolute last time they would ever make me feel this small, this worthless. They thought I was a nobody. Fine. I would build a new life, a new world for myself, and I would do it in complete silence. They would never see it coming. The next day, my phone was a minefield. A series of texts from my mother buzzed on the nightstand, each one a little paper cut. "You left so suddenly. Tiffany didn't mean it like that. You're always so sensitive, Savannah. It was Christmas, you shouldn't have made a scene by leaving." I swiped each notification away, the anger from the night before hardening into a cold, quiet resolve. I ignored a call from my dad, which I knew would be a gruff, 5-second command to apologize to my sister for being dramatic. I let it all go to voicemail, but then, a different name flashed on the screen. Grandma, Eleanor, my father's mother, the family's 83-year-old matriarch, and the only person whose opinion I still valued. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. Her voice was crackly but clear, with none of the pity or condescension I expected. "Savannah," she said, her tone sharp and direct. "I saw what Tiffany did yesterday. I saw the look on your face when you left." "No, you're not," she cut back. "And that's all right. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to let a girl who thinks a fancy car is a personality trait define you for the rest of your life?" She wasn't offering me a shoulder to cry on. She was offering me a weapon. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, the confession feeling heavy. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in her study. "When I was your age," she began, "people thought women were only good for two things, typing and having babies. I decided they were wrong." She paused again. "Do you remember the old Blackwood estate? Out on the edge of town? The one with the wrought iron gates you used to be so fascinated with as a child? As a kid, I'd imagined it was haunted, filled with secret passages and lost treasures. My passion for architecture and history had started with that house. Of course I remember it. The woman who built it, Genevieve Blackwood, was widowed at 30 with almost nothing to her name. Grandma Eleanor explained. She built a shipping empire from a single leaky boat. They called her ruthless. They called her a man in a dress. But she built that house with her own two hands. A testament to the fact that she didn't care what they called her. She cared what she built. That place has been empty for 50 years, Grandma continued, her voice lowering slightly, as if sharing a secret. Tangled up in legal battles and family disputes after the last of the Blackwoods passed away without a clear heir. A messy, complicated will reading that went on for years. But I heard something interesting last week at my bridge club. The county is tired of waiting. They're finally putting the entire property up for a public tax auction to pay off decades of back taxes. It's a huge, crumbling inheritance that nobody wants. The words echoed in my mind. A crazy, impossible, terrifying idea began to form. It was a flicker of light in the darkness of my humiliation. A mansion, a ruin, an opportunity. Grandma, that's impossible, I breathed, the scale of it overwhelming me. The word impossible is just an opinion, Savannah, she said, her voice firm. It's not a fact. You're smarter than Tiffany gives you credit for. You're smarter than your parents think. The question is, are you brave enough to believe it yourself? We hung up a few minutes later, but her words stayed with me. The image of the Blackwood estate filled my mind. It was no longer a ghost story. It was a blueprint. It was a long shot. A desperate gamble born from a moment of deep pain. But for the first time since I'd walked out of my parents' house on Christmas Day, it felt like something that was truly, completely mine. The enemy wasn't just my family. It was my own self-doubt, my own circumstances, the little voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my sister, Tiffany, telling me I was a failure. The battleground was my tiny apartment, and my weapons were a search engine and a burning, righteous anger. The target was the Blackwood estate. My first stop was the county website. After hours of navigating clunky, outdated portals, I found it, a public notice for the upcoming tax lien auction. The Blackwood estate, listed as a single parcel of land, 40 acres, one primary residence, multiple outbuildings, was the headline item. The minimum bid was a number that made me feel physically ill. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life, but it was also a fraction of what the property, even in its ruined state, was likely worth. To even participate in the auction, I needed to provide a certified check for 10% of the minimum bid. That deposit alone was a small fortune. A wave of despair washed over me. It was impossible. But then I remembered Grandma Eleanor's words. The word impossible is just an opinion. I opened a new spreadsheet and named it War Fund. The first thing I did was list my assets. It was a short, depressing list. My savings were gone, thanks to my car. My checking account was a joke. But I did have one thing. In a small velvet-lined box in my closet was a collection of jewelry my mother had given me over the years for birthdays and graduation. A thin gold chain, a pair of pearl earrings, a delicate bracelet. They were pieces from her side of the family, beautiful but carrying the faint weight of disappointment. She always gave them with a sigh, as if to say, "Here's something nice to make up for your otherwise unshiny life." The next morning, I walked into a pawn shop, the velvet box feeling heavy in my purse. The man behind the counter barely looked at me as he weighed the gold and inspected the pearls. He offered me a number that felt like a punch to the gut. It was a pittance, but it was a start. I took the cash without flinching. This wasn't a loss. It was a liquidation of the old me. That was the beginning of my tangible struggle. My life split into two. By day, I was Savannah, the quiet, efficient administrative assistant. I smiled. I answered phones. I filed paperwork. But by night, and on every single weekend, I became a different person. I took on a second, then a third, freelance job online, doing mind-numbing data entry and transcription work until my eyes burned and my fingers ached. I stopped going out. I stopped buying coffee. My diet became a rotation of instant noodles, eggs, and bread. I moved out of my small but decent one-bedroom apartment and into a tiny studio on the worst side of town. The building smelled like boiled cabbage and dampness, and my window looked out onto a brick wall. But the rent was half of what I'd been paying. Every dollar I saved, every penny I earned, went directly into a high-yield savings account I'd labeled Blackwood. I spent my lunch breaks, not in the break room with my coworkers, but in the silence of the public library. I checked out books on property law, historical restoration, and tax auctions. I became an expert on liens, deeds, and zoning variances. The librarians started to know me by name. I was a ghost, haunting the non-fiction aisles, fueled by cheap coffee and a desperate hope. There were moments of crushing doubt. One night, about a month before the auction, I sat on the floor of my tiny studio, my laptop open to my bank account. I had been working myself to the bone for weeks, sacrificing every comfort, and I was still thousands of dollars short of the deposit. The number on the screen seemed to mock me, a wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like grief washed over me. Tiffany's voice echoed in my head. Loser. Failure. Nobody. Maybe. She was right. Maybe this was all a pathetic fantasy, a childish dream I had no business chasing. I almost gave up right then. I almost closed the laptop, crawled into bed, and surrendered to the life everyone expected me to live. But then I thought of the pie, of my father's proud look at Chad, of my mother's weak smile, and the anger returned, a hot, cleansing fire. I would not quit. I had been avoiding her calls, ashamed to admit that despite everything, I was probably going to fail. This time, I knew I had to answer. Savannah, she said, her voice as direct as ever. The auction is next Tuesday. How are we doing? I finally confessed, my voice cracking with exhaustion and shame. I'm short, Grandma. I'm a few $1,000s short for the deposit. I've sold everything I can. I'm working 3 jobs. It's not enough. I braced myself for the I told you so, or worse, the pity, but it never came. There was a thoughtful silence on the line. Money is just a tool, Savannah, she said finally, her tone measured. Sometimes it's the wrong tool for the job. Knowledge is power, and connections are the key to unlocking that power. What are you talking about? I've been making some calls, she said, and I could almost hear the sly smile in her voice. I know the old lawyer who handled the Blackwood will reading decades ago. His name is Arthur Abernath. He's 90 years old, retired for 20 years, but his mind is still as sharp as a tack. He's forgotten more about that property than anyone else has ever known. A lawyer? Grandma? I can't afford a lawyer, I said, the panic rising in my chest. I can't even afford the deposit. Stop thinking about what you can't afford, and start thinking about what you can offer, she countered. You've been studying. You have passion. Mr. Abernathy is an old man who is bored to tears with daytime television and predictable mystery novels. Maybe, just maybe, you're the most interesting thing to walk into his life in years. His office was on Elm Street. The sign is gone, but I suspect he still gets his mail there. It was a crazy idea, but it was the only one I had left. The next day I took the afternoon off work and found the old building on Elm Street. It was a dusty, forgotten place, sandwiched between a vape shop and a laundromat. I walked up a creaky flight of stairs to a door with a faded brass plaque that simply read, A. Abernathy. A few moments later, the door opened, and a tiny ancient man with eyes as bright and blue as a summer sky peered out at me. He was hunched over a walker, but his gaze was sharp and intelligent. I'm looking for Mr. Abernathy, I said, my heart pounding. You've found what's left of him, he rasped. What do you want? I spent the next 2 hours in his dusty, book-filled office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and lemon polish. I laid everything out for him, my research, my financial struggles, my desperate, crazy plan to buy the Blackwood estate. I didn't hold back. I showed him my spreadsheets, my notes on zoning laws, my historical research on Genevieve Blackwood. I expected him to laugh at me, to dismiss me as a naive, foolish girl. Instead, he listened. He leaned forward, his bright eyes scanning my documents, a flicker of something interest, maybe even excitement, dawning on his face. When I was finished, he sat back and tapped a wrinkled finger on a stack of my research. You've done your homework, young lady, he said, his voice a dry rustle, more than any of the vultures who tried to pick that estate apart for decades. He then stood up, shuffled over to a massive filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick, dust-covered folder. The Blackwood will was a masterpiece of legal protection, he explained, opening the folder. Genevieve was a smart woman. She knew people would try to tear down what she built. Tucked away in the town charter, there's a historical preservation ordinance. Because of the estate's unique architectural and historical significance, it's eligible for a massive preservation grant from the state, a grant that could cover a significant portion of the restoration cost. My heart leaped. A grant? Evie? A grant? Here's the loophole, he said, a glint in his eye. The application is a bureaucratic nightmare, and more importantly, it has to be filed and pre-approved before the property is acquired. No one ever bothered. It was too much work. They just wanted to bulldoze the place and sell the land. He looked at me, a real smile spreading across his face. For the first time, you, Miss Savannah, are not them. You appreciate the history. You have the passion. He closed the folder with a decisive thud. This is the most interesting thing that has crossed my desk in 20 years. I'll help you with the grant application, pro bono, on one condition. I walked out of that office feeling like I could fly. Grandma Eleanor had been right. She hadn't given me money. She had given me something far more valuable. A key to a door I never even knew existed. The auction was in 6 days, and for the first time, I believed I could actually win. The days leading up to the auction were a frantic blur of paperwork and nervous energy. Mr. Abernathy was a force of nature. He knew every loophole, every form, every clerk at the county office. We worked tirelessly, submitting the complex historical preservation grant application just under the wire. It wasn't an approval, but it was a pre-qualification, a crucial piece of leverage that no other potential bidder would have. The deposit money was still a terrifyingly large sum, but with the grant's potential, the final purchase price seemed slightly less astronomical. It was still a massive gamble. In the midst of this controlled chaos, a mandatory family event loomed: my cousin Blake's 30th birthday party. The thought of facing my family again made my stomach churn, but skipping it would only create more drama. So I put on a brave face, dressed in the nicest, simplest outfit I owned, and drove to the rented hall. The party was in full swing, loud and suffocatingly cheerful. I spotted my sister Tiffany immediately, of course, holding court near the gift table, laughing her loud, theatrical laugh. I tried to make myself invisible, heading straight for the bar to grab a club soda. But my brother-in-law, Chad, intercepted me. He looked even more uncomfortable than usual, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Hey, Savannah," he mumbled, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. "Listen, about Christmas, she was out of line." I was so surprised I almost dropped my drink. It was the closest thing to an apology or an acknowledgement of my existence I'd received from that side of the family in years. Before I could even respond, however, Tiffany's sharp voice cut through the noise. "Chad, honey, come meet the caterer. He loves your watch." Chad jumped like he'd been electrocuted. "Coming, dear," he called back. He gave me a final pained look. "Sorry," he whispered, then scurried away toward his wife, a perfect textbook demonstration of his role as the spineless enabler. He had the capacity for decency, but it was dwarfed by his fear of Tiffany's disapproval. I sighed and turned away, only to bump into my cousin Blake. "Savannah, glad you could make it," he said, giving me a warm hug. "There's someone I want you to meet." He gestured to the woman standing beside him. "This is my fiancée, Madison." I found myself looking at a woman who was the epitome of New York City chic. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored black jumpsuit, her dark hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob. She had a kind, intelligent face, and a firm, confident handshake. She was the neutral observer, though I didn't know it at the time. "It's so nice to finally meet you," Madison said, her smile genuine. "Blake has told me so much about his family." "All good things, I hope," I said with a small, wry smile. "So, Savannah, what is it that you do?" she asked, making polite conversation. Before I could answer, Tiffany materialized at my side, a predatory glint in her eyes. She draped an arm over my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but felt like a cage. "Oh, Madison, you're so sweet to ask," she purred. "Our Savannah works in administration. She's still, figuring things out." The condescension was palpable. She patted my shoulder, a final little act of dominance, before steering the conversation toward her own recent successes in the real estate market. I felt my face flush with the familiar sting of humiliation. I glanced at Madison. She was a professional event planner from a world of high stakes and powerful people. I expected to see a flicker of pity or dismissal in her eyes. Instead, I saw something else. She was watching my sister, her expression perfectly polite and non-committal, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. She was observing the dynamic, processing the subtle cruelty, filing it away. It was a brief, almost imperceptible moment, but it struck me. She wasn't judging me, she was judging Tiffany. The interaction left me feeling shaky, but as I drove home that night, the feeling transformed into something else. It was cold, hard determination. Tiffany thought she was showing off her success, but all she had done was show her true colors to a stranger, and it made me more desperate than ever to show them all who I really was. Auction day arrived on a cold gray Tuesday. The air itself felt heavy with anticipation. I didn't go to work. I sat in my tiny studio apartment, staring at the certified check on my little kitchen table. It represented every sacrifice I had made over the past few months. The sold jewelry, the countless nights of lost sleep, the endless cups of instant noodles. It was everything I had. The auction was held in a sterile, impersonal room in the county government building. The seats were uncomfortable plastic, the lighting was a dull fluorescent hum, and the air smelled of stale coffee. It was the least glamorous setting imaginable for such a life-altering event. I saw no one I knew. My family, who loved to broadcast their every success, wouldn't dream of being seen in a place like this, a place for foreclosures and failures. It was the perfect cover. I took a seat in the back row, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure the people next to me could hear it. Mr. Abernathy had coached me on the process. "Don't bid early," he'd warned. "Let the amateurs wear themselves out. Project confidence, even if your hands are shaking, and don't go a penny over the absolute maximum we agreed upon." The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a slicked-back haircut, rattled through a dozen smaller properties before he finally announced, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the main event, Parcel 7B, commonly known as the Blackwood Estate." A murmur went through the room. A few other serious-looking bidders, men in suits who looked like developers, straightened in their seats. The bidding started, and it was fast and furious. My hands grew clammy, the numbers climbed at a dizzying speed, quickly surpassing what I thought was possible. My stomach sank. The developers were in a league I couldn't compete with. But then, just as Mr. Abernathy had predicted, the bidding began to slow as the price reached a certain threshold. The amateurs and low-level investors dropped out, one by one. It came down to me and one other man, a burly guy in an expensive suit who looked supremely confident. He kept outbidding me instantly, trying to intimidate me. My heart was in my throat. We were approaching my absolute limit. I took a deep breath, pictured Tiffany's smug face at Christmas, and held up my bidding paddle one last time. I announced my bid in a voice that was surprisingly clear and steady. The man in the suit scoffed. He looked at me, a dismissive sneer on his face, as if to say, "You can't be serious." He conferred with his partner, then shook his head. He was out. "Going once," the auctioneer called out, his eyes on me. "Going twice." The silence in the room was deafening. Every second felt like an hour. "Sold," the auctioneer shouted, banging his gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. To the young lady in the back row, for a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It didn't feel real. Then a slow smile spread across my face. I had done it. I walked on trembling legs to the front of the room and signed the paperwork, my hand shaking so hard my signature was barely legible. I handed over the check, and in return, I was given a thick stack of documents. On top was the preliminary property deed. My name was printed right there in black and white, Savannah Miller, owner. I walked out of that building and into the gray afternoon, clutching the deed like it was the most precious object in the world. The secret transformation was no longer a dream, it was real, tangible, and terrifying. The first time I visited the Blackwood estate as its legal owner was an experience of both awe and horror. The massive wrought iron gates were rusted and choked with ivy. I used a pair of bolt cutters I'd bought at the hardware store to snap the old corroded chain. The sound echoed in the unnerving silence. As I drove up the long, winding driveway, branches scraped against the sides of my old car. The mansion emerged from behind a curtain of overgrown trees like a sleeping giant. Up close, it was even more dilapidated than I had imagined. Paint peeled from the walls in long, sun-baked strips. Several windows were shattered, dark eyes staring out blankly. The grand front porch sagged dangerously in the middle. This was my kingdom. It was a wreck. For the next 6 months, the estate became my entire world. This was where my secret life truly took root. Every weekend, from sunrise to sunset, and most weeknights after my day job, I was there. I was covered in a permanent layer of dust and grime. My hands, once soft from typing, were now calloused and rough, with a collection of nicks and scratches. I learned to plaster walls by watching YouTube videos. I learned basic plumbing to fix a leaky pipe in what used to be the butler's pantry. I spent an entire month just clearing out the debris from the ground floor, rotting furniture, fallen plaster, and mountains of forgotten junk. It was grueling, lonely, back-breaking work. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, but I was also more fulfilled than I had ever been in my life. In this secret world, I wasn't Savannah the failure. I wasn't Tiffany's useless little sister. Here, I was the boss, the founder, the one in charge. Every repaired window, every cleared room, was a small victory, a brick I laid in the foundation of my new self. I was building more than a house. I was rebuilding my own life, piece by painful piece. The first 6 months of owning the Blackwood estate were a lonely, brutal education in hard labor. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a corner was turned. My focus had been on making one small part of the mansion livable, a base of operations from which I could launch the rest of the restoration. I chose the old library on the ground floor, with its towering built-in mahogany shelves and beautiful bay window, and the small guest suite attached to it. After what felt like an eternity of sanding, painting, and painstakingly restoring the original hardwood floors, it was done. The library was magnificent again. The rich smell of wood polish and old books replaced the stench of damp and decay. I found a local artisan to repair the stained glass window at the top of the bay, and when the light streamed through it in the late afternoon, it filled the room with dazzling color. The attached guest suite, which I had modernized with a new bathroom and a small kitchenette, was clean, elegant, and peaceful. This small, restored corner of the massive, ruined house was my first tangible taste of success. It was beautiful, and it was mine. But beauty alone wouldn't pay the mounting bills for contractors and supplies. I needed to generate income, and fast. Taking a huge leap of faith, I took professional-looking photos of the guest suite and library and listed it on a high-end vacation rental website, marketing it as a historic writer's retreat. I described the history of the estate, the peace and quiet, the inspiring view of the valley. I set a price that made my hands sweat, and I held my breath. It was booked within a week. A novelist from Chicago rented it for a month. I was terrified. What if he hated it? What if something broke? But at the end of his stay, he left a glowing 5-star review. He raved about the peaceful atmosphere, the beauty of the restored library, and the palpable sense of history. He wrote, "It's a place where you can feel the ambition of the woman who built it. A truly magical retreat." That review was like a dam breaking. The bookings started to pour in. The small but steady stream of income was a game changer. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. I was able to quit my third freelance data entry job. Then, a month later, my second. I could finally afford to hire a small, dedicated crew of local contractors, a semi-retired carpenter, a young electrician just starting his own business, who respected the history of the house as much as I did. The estate, which had been silent for so long, was now filled with the sounds of progress, the buzz of saws, the tap of hammers, the murmur of conversation. It was slowly coming back to life. One sunny Saturday afternoon, I drove to Grandma Eleanor's house, a small album of photos in my hand. I hadn't told her about the auction, about the deed, about any of it. I wanted to show her, not just tell her. We sat in her sunroom, and I opened the album. The first few photos showed the mansion as I'd found it, ruined, crumbling, hopeless. Then I turned the page to show her the restored library, the gleaming floors, the light pouring through the stained glass. I showed her the cozy guest suite and the 5-star review from the novelist. She looked at the photos for a long time, her finger tracing the image of the library. She didn't cheer or gasp or offer loud congratulations. Her reaction was quieter and far more meaningful. She looked up at me, and her eyes, usually so sharp and piercing, were soft with a profound, knowing pride. "I knew you had it in you, Savannah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Genevieve Blackwood would be proud." I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. Her belief in me was the one thing I had clung to in the darkest moments. Her approval felt more valuable than any amount of money or success. I drove away from her house that day, feeling not just like a property owner, but like I was finally, truly becoming the person she always saw in me. Just when I thought things were finally on a steady upward trajectory, disaster struck. It came in the form of a summer storm, a violent, freakish tempest that tore through the valley one August night. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. I was at the estate, working late in the library, when I heard it, a sound I will never forget. It was a deep, groaning crack, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the very foundations of the house. My heart stopped. I ran from the library, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and followed the sound to the grand ballroom. The sight that greeted me made me sick to my stomach. A massive oak tree from the yard had been uprooted by the wind and had smashed through the roof. A huge section of the ballroom's ornate ceiling had collapsed, and rain was pouring in, flooding the half-restored hardwood floors. The damage was astronomical. It was a catastrophic setback, undoing months of painstaking work and draining thousands of dollars in materials. My emergency funds were already stretched thin. I called my insurance agent the next morning, my voice trembling. The news was bleak. Because the property was under active, large-scale renovation, my policy had specific clauses. They would cover a portion of the damage, but nowhere near the full cost of the repair. I was looking at a shortfall that was simply insurmountable. My primary contractor, a good man but a practical one, came to assess the damage. He walked through the ruined ballroom, shaking his head. "Savannah, I'm sorry," he said, his voice grim. "The structural work alone to fix this, it's a massive job. I can't keep my crew here waiting. I need to be paid for the work we've already done, and I can't start this new work without a significant payment up front." I didn't have it. My credit cards were maxed out from buying supplies. The income from the guest suite was a steady stream, but this was a tidal wave. I was on the verge of financial ruin. The dream was collapsing around me. Literally, the victory I had felt so close to was slipping through my fingers like rainwater. That night, I sat alone on the floor of the ruined ballroom, the smell of wet plaster and rain-soaked wood filling the air. The moonlight shone through the gaping hole in the roof, illuminating the destruction. I was ready to admit defeat. Tiffany was right. My parents were right. I was a failure, who had gotten in over her head. This project was too big, too much. I was a fool for ever believing I could do it. Tears of sheer hopeless exhaustion streamed down my face. Just as I was about to give in completely to the despair, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness of the long driveway. A few minutes later, the ballroom door creaked open. It was Grandma Eleanor. She didn't say a word. She just walked over to me, holding a large thermos and a rolled-up set of papers. She sat down on the dusty floor beside me, poured 2 cups of steaming coffee, and handed one to me. We sat in silence for a while, just sipping the coffee. Then she unrolled the papers. They were a copy of the original blueprints of the house, the ones she'd gotten from Mr. Abernathy. She spread them out on the floor between us, the intricate hand-drawn lines a map of a forgotten dream. "The woman who built this house, Genevieve," Grandma began, her voice soft but steady, "faced a fire in 1918 that nearly destroyed the West Wing. She faced a flood in 1927 that ruined her entire first floor, and she faced the Great Depression, which nearly wiped out her fortune." She tapped a finger on the blueprint, right over the ballroom. "But she never quit. She rebuilt, every single time, stronger, smarter. This house is a survivor, Savannah. It has good bones." She looked up from the blueprint and met my eyes, her gaze piercing. "Just like you." Her words were not a solution, but they were a fortification. They rebuilt something inside of me that had crumbled. She didn't bring money. She brought perspective. She reminded me of the why behind my struggle. I wasn't just fixing a building. I was honoring a legacy of resilience. We stayed up late into the night, poring over the old blueprints. And there, in the original structural plans, we found it. A detail about the roof trusses, An archaic design that, with a modern engineering approach, could be reinforced in a way that was far more cost-effective than a complete replacement. It wasn't a magic wand, but it was a path forward, a creative, intelligent solution that didn't just require money, but knowledge. The next day, I didn't feel defeated. I felt steely. I took the blueprints to a structural engineer. I called in favors. I negotiated a payment plan with my contractor, showing him the new, more efficient plan. I took out a small, high-interest business loan, not as a sign of defeat, but as a strategic investment. I was no longer just the emotional owner of the property, I was its true steward, its commander, making tough, calculated decisions to ensure its survival. The storm had almost broken me, but instead, it had solidified my position as the true, unshakable owner of the Blackwood estate. Almost a full year had passed since the pie incident. A year of dust, debt, and determination. My life was unrecognizable from what it had been, but to my family, I was still the same old Savannah. My secret was perfectly kept. My tiny, cheap studio apartment and my beat-up car were an effective camouflage. They saw what they expected to see. Then one Tuesday morning, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line, written in a bubbly, festive font, was like a declaration of war. "You're invited. Grandma Eleanor's 85th birthday reunion." It was from Tiffany. I opened it with a sense of grim curiosity. The email was a masterpiece of my sister's particular brand of boastful, passive-aggressive communication. "Dearest family," it began, "as you all know, our amazing matriarch, Grandma Eleanor, is turning 85. To celebrate this incredible milestone, I thought she deserved more than just a simple get-together. She deserves a party that reflects the success and love of her family. So, I have taken the liberty of booking the most exclusive, most sought-after new venue in the entire state, the Blackwood Manor. It's a beautifully restored historic estate, and let me tell you, it was nearly impossible to get a reservation, but I pulled a few strings. It's going to be a night to remember." I had to read it twice. The Blackwood Manor. That's what I had decided to call the venue side of the business. My venue. She had booked my venue for a party celebrating the one person who had been my secret champion all along. The irony was so thick, so perfectly delicious, I almost choked on my coffee. Tiffany's email continued, bragging about the catering package she'd selected, the string quartet she'd hired, and the black-tie dress code. "Let's give Grandma a party she deserves," she wrote, surrounded by family success. I scrolled to the bottom of the email, and there it was, the final, perfect little twist of the knife she couldn't resist. "P.S. Savannah, please, please try to make it. We know it's a bit fancy for you, and the drive is far, but it would mean so much to Grandma to have everyone there. Don't worry about a gift, your presence is enough." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of anger or bitterness. It was the smile of a chess player who sees the board and realizes her opponent has just walked, with blissful ignorance, straight into a checkmate she laid out 10 moves ago. "Aifit repile." My response was simple, short, and sweet. "Ava, I wouldn't miss it for the world. Can't wait to celebrate with everyone. Best, Savannah." I drove my old, beat-up car and parked it discreetly at the far end of the sprawling lot, hidden behind a line of expensive European sedans and SUVs. As I walked toward the entrance of the mansion, my mansion, the sound of the string quartet I had hired drifted through the warm evening air. The grand ballroom, the very room that had almost been my ruin, was now aglow with candlelight, its restored floors gleaming, the gaping hole in its roof a distant, conquered memory. It was stunning, and the sight of it filled me with a quiet, fierce pride. I had dressed carefully, not in a flashy, expensive gown, but in a simple, classic, floor-length navy blue dress. It was elegant and understated. I wanted my victory to be in the reveal, not in my appearance. I stepped into the ballroom, and it was exactly as I had pictured. My family was gathered in small, laughing clusters. My mother and father were beaming, looking proud and prosperous, and there, at the center of it all, was Tiffany, acting as the grand hostess. She spotted me the moment I walked in, and her face broke into a wide, condescending smile. "Savannah, you came," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. She glided over to me and gave me an air kiss next to each cheek. "I'm so glad. You look nice. Don't worry. The bar is open. Go get yourself a drink." The implication was clear. You don't belong here, but we'll tolerate you. I just smiled politely. "It's a beautiful venue, Tiffany. You have great taste." Throughout the next hour, they laid the groundwork for their own demise. It was a masterclass in casual cruelty. My mother came over to tell me I looked a little tired. "Are you working too hard at that little job of yours, dear?" she asked, her voice laced with faux concern. My father clapped me on the shoulder and pointed out Chad's new, ridiculously expensive watch. "See that, Savannah? That's what success looks like. Maybe Chad can give you some career advice." Tiffany made sure to introduce me to her important friends from the real estate world, always with a little qualifier. "This is my little sister, Savannah. She's the artistic one in the family, still finding her path." They were publicly, methodically, humiliating me one last time, reinforcing the narrative they had built for me my entire life. I was the poor relation, the charity case, the failure they had to graciously include. And I let them. I remained calm. I smiled. I nodded. I was an observer at my own execution, knowing that the hangman had no idea who had built the gallows. From across the room, I saw my cousin Blake and his fiancée Madison. I watched as Madison observed these interactions. Her face was a polite mask, but I could see the thoughtful, critical look in her eyes as she watched Tiffany's performance. She was the neutral party, the impartial judge, and my family was putting on quite a show for her. I also saw Chad, my brother-in-law, hovering nervously at the edge of every conversation. He'd make eye contact with me for a fleeting second, a look of deep discomfort on his face, before quickly looking away. He knew it was wrong, but he would never ever say a word. They were all playing their parts perfectly, and the stage was set for the final act. The moment arrived after dinner. The string quartet finished a piece, and the room fell into a polite hush. Tiffany, glowing with self-importance, glided to the small raised platform where a microphone stood waiting. She tapped it lightly, a broad smile plastered on her face. "I just want to thank you all for coming to celebrate our wonderful Grandma Eleanor. She's the rock of this family." She paused for a smattering of applause, which Grandma Eleanor acknowledged with a gracious knowing nod. She praised our parents for raising such a go-getter. She praised her husband Chad for being her rock and partner in success. Then, she turned her gaze slowly, deliberately, across the room, until it landed on me. A small, cruel smirk played on her lip. "And I have to say," she continued, her voice dripping with magnanimity, "I am just so proud to have been able to bring our whole family together in a place like this, a place of history, of elegance, of stature." She gestured around the magnificent room. "It's a testament to what hard work and a real career can get you. It's about setting goals and achieving them." My parents were beaming, their faces shining with pride for their successful daughter. Chad looked relieved that the speech was almost over. Tiffany was about to step down, her performance complete, when a figure moved purposefully from the edge of the room. It was Claire, my venue manager, a sharp, professional woman in her 40s, dressed in a crisp black suit. I had given her very specific instructions. She approached me, not Tiffany, her expression calm and professional. She didn't wait for a break in the conversation. She created one. "Excuse me, ma'am," Claire said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and carried through the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearest tables. The word hung in the air. "Ma'am." I turned to her. "Yes, Claire? Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect, ma'am," she replied smoothly. "I just wanted to confirm. We are ready to begin the fireworks display on your signal. Also, the catering has a slight overage due to the extra guests. Should I put that on your main account for the manor, or would you prefer a separate invoice for tonight's event?" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The entire family, my parents, my sister, my brother-in-law, they all froze. It was as if someone had hit a pause button on the entire scene. Tiffany turned so pale that her bright red lipstick looked like a gash on her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. My father's jaw literally dropped, his mouth hung open, and a look of utter, uncomprehending shock washed over his features. He looked from me to Claire and back again, his mind visibly failing to process what he had just heard. She just stood there, a champagne glass, frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. But the real masterstroke was yet to come, before anyone could recover, before a single word could be stammered. Grandma Eleanor stood up from her seat at the head table. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded the attention of the entire room. She walked to the podium, took the microphone from Tiffany's limp, unresisting hand, and smiled. It was a warm, sweet smile, but her eyes were gleaming with triumph. "Tiffany, dear, that was a lovely sentiment," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone filling every corner of the ballroom. "And this is a truly spectacular party." She paused, letting the silence stretch. Then she turned her gaze to me, her smile widening. "But I have just one question for your sister. It's something I've been wondering all evening." She looked directly at me, her eyes twinkling. "The Savannah, dear," she announced to the silent, stunned room. "Who was it exactly that bought the mansion I live in?" The room didn't just erupt in whispers. It was more like a single, collective gasp. Every eye in that ballroom, family, friends, Tiffany's business associates, swiveled to stare at me. The spotlight Tiffany had so desperately craved was now mine, and it was blinding. The moment was perfectly orchestrated, and the fallout was immediate, rippling through the crowd as my supporting cast played their final, crucial roles. Grandma Eleanor, my ally, stood at the podium, a benevolent queen who had just checkmated the entire board. She held the microphone, her expression one of pure, unadulterated pride, a silent testament to her unwavering faith in me. Her question hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as a coronation. Madison, my cousin's sharp and elegant fiancé, had been watching the entire exchange with wide, intelligent eyes. She turned to Blake, her voice a stage whisper that was perfectly audible to the surrounding tables. "Oh my God, Blake," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Your cousin, she owns this entire resort." The look on her face wasn't just shock, it was pure, unadulterated admiration. It was a look of respect from a peer, from an outsider who understood the language of power and success. In that single moment, she validated my victory to the entire room, framing it not as a family squabble, but as an astonishing achievement. And then there was the enabler. Chad, my brother-in-law, looked completely lost, a ship without a rudder. He turned to his wife, his face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. "Tiff, what is going on?" he stammered, his voice weak. Did you know?" He looked at the invoice in Claire's hand, then at me, then back at his pale, silent wife. The foundation of his comfortable world, built on his wife's supposed superiority, was crumbling beneath his feet. My parents looked like they had seen a ghost. Their faces were ashen, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a terrible dawning shame. They looked at me as if for the first time, not as their failure of a daughter, but as a stranger, a powerful woman they didn't know at all. She was being humiliated on a scale she could never have conceived, in front of everyone whose opinion she valued, at a party she had designed to celebrate her own success. She was a statue of silent, impotent rage. I watched it all unfold for a beat, letting the reality of the situation sink into every corner of the room. Then, I walked forward, and gently took the microphone from my grandmother's hand. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces, my gaze lingering for a moment on my sister and my parents. My voice when I spoke was not loud or angry, it was calm, steady, and clear. "Grandma," I said, a small, genuine smile touching my lips. "To answer your question, I did. I bought it. Turns out all that money I saved on store-bought pies added up." I paused, then addressed the entire room. "Please, everyone, enjoy the party. The string quartet is wonderful, and the fireworks are about to begin. I looked at Claire, my manager. It's all on the house. The fallout was like a social nuclear bomb. The room split into two distinct camps. Guests, friends, and distant relatives began to applaud. First, tentatively, then with genuine enthusiasm. They were either staring at Tiffany and my parents with open disbelief, or approaching me with wide eyes and outstretched hands, offering congratulations. I was suddenly the most interesting person in the room. They stood in a small, tight cluster of shame, the space around them clearing as if they were contagious. Tiffany, for the first time in her life, was the one who was kicked out, who was banned, not by force, but by the sheer crushing weight of her own public humiliation. She had built her identity on being the center of attention, and now she was, but for all the wrong reasons. She grabbed Chad by the arm and practically dragged him toward the exit without a word, her head held high in a pathetic attempt to salvage a shred of dignity. It didn't work. The party continued, but its entire axis had shifted. It was no longer Tiffany's party, it was mine. The immediate aftermath was even more satisfyingly chaotic than I could have imagined. As Tiffany dragged Chad toward the exit, their composure finally shattered once they were out of the ballroom. Through the large windows, I could see them in the brightly lit parking lot, having a huge, explosive fight. Tiffany was waving her arms, her face contorted with rage. Chad, for once, was yelling back, his meekness finally burned away by the public humiliation she had subjected him to. It was the first time I had ever seen him stand up to her, and it was happening because her carefully constructed world of lies had been demolished. My parents, looking lost and aged, made a hesitant approach toward me. My father, who had so proudly boasted about his successful son-in-law, couldn't even meet my eyes. My mother wrung her hands, her face a mask of regret. "Savannah," my mother began, her voice trembling. We didn't know. This is incredible. We are so proud of you." The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to rewrite 28 years of history. I just looked at them, my expression calm, not angry, just empty of the old need for their approval. "You didn't believe in me for 28 years, I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Why start now, Esau?" I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in the middle of the ballroom, their worldview completely shattered. The golden child was a fraud, and the failure they had pitied and scorned was now a powerful CEO, and the owner of the very ground on which they stood. They had backed the wrong horse, and the realization was a brutal public reckoning. The rest of the evening was surreal. People I hadn't spoken to in years came up to me, their voices full of awe and respect. My cousin Blake gave me a bone-crushing hug, whispering, "I am so incredibly impressed, Sav." "So impressed." Madison, his fiancée, shook my hand warmly. "That was the single most elegant takedown I have ever witnessed," she said with a grin. "When you're ready to host corporate events here, you call me first." Later that night, long after the last guest had departed, and the cleanup crew was quietly at work, I stood on the grand veranda, with Grandma Eleanor. We watched the last of the fireworks, my fireworks fizzle out against the dark, starry sky. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked gently. "I'm better than all right, Grandma," I said, breathing in the cool night air. "I'm free." They had spent years trying to put me in a box, and I had responded by buying the whole damn factory. Their world was in ruins, but mine was just beginning. A few weeks later, the chaos had settled into a new, peaceful reality. The air at the Blackwood mansion no longer felt like a battleground, but like a sanctuary. I was having coffee on the wide, sun-drenched veranda, the very spot where I had stood with my grandmother after the party. The view of the valley below was clear and bright. Across the table from me sat two women who represented my new foundation. Grandma Eleanor, my constant, my ally, sipped her tea with a contented smile, and next to her was Madison, who had gone from being a neutral observer to a trusted friend and a brilliant business associate. The board of the Philharmonic was blown away by the photos, Madison was saying, tapping on her tablet. "They want to book the ballroom for their annual fundraising gala." And I told them, she added with a wink, that the owner is a personal friend, so they'd better be on their best behavior. Grandma Eleanor chuckled. Oh, I think you've earned the right to have as many store-bought pies as you like, dear. Our conversation was a hum of positive, forward-looking energy. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine affection. This was my new family, my new board of directors. The old one, built on a toxic brew of jealousy, neglect, and lies, had simply faded away. I hadn't heard from Tiffany. I'd heard through the grapevine that she and Chad were in counseling. My parents had sent a few awkward pleading texts, which I had read and then deleted without reply. Forgiveness might come someday, but trust was a structure that had been completely demolished, and I wasn't interested in rebuilding on that compromised ground. The quiet admin assistant was gone. The girl who cried in her car over a cheap insult was a ghost. As I looked out over the sprawling estate, my estate, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been born from a moment of deep humiliation, a painful wound inflicted by the people who were supposed to love me most. But that pain had been the catalyst, the fire that forged something new and strong. The mansion wasn't just a property, it was a symbol. It was proof that I had taken their greatest insult, that I was a nobody, and built an entire world out of it. A world where I was the founder, the owner, the one who decided what was valuable. And that was a victory far sweeter than any revenge. My story is proof that the labels other people give you, failure, loser, nobody, only have the power you allow them to have. Your real value is something you have to build for yourself, sometimes in secret, until you're ready to show the world. What labels have you had to overcome in your life? What names have you refused to accept? I would be so honored to read your stories. Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about turning pain into power. It helps more than you know.